Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Rockefeller Center as we celebrate Veterans Day. My name is Jack Boger, and I'll be serving as a moderator for our discussion this afternoon on World War II Remembered, Then and Now. I'm a senior at Dartmouth, and I was asked by Sabna Hall, the Deputy Director of the Rockefeller Center, to help out today through my work as a Rockefeller Leadership Fellow, and because upon graduation, I'll be commissioning as a Second Lieutenant in the Marine Corps, along with my buddy Joe Malkin up here. When Sabna reached out, I was humbled, and it truly is my privilege and honor to be here with our wonderful panelists this afternoon. The man on my left is Clint Gardner, class of '44. He served for 4 years in the Army as an officer in the anti-aircraft artillery. He was wounded in the D-Day invasion at Normandy and again in the Battle of the Bulge. Shortly before the war in Europe ended, he was put in the charge of the recently liberated Buchenwald Concentration camp. He'd reached the rank of captain when he returned to finish Dartmouth in 1946 to 1947. In 1956, he and his wife Libby founded a national mail order company called Shopping International, a venture based in Norwich, Vermont that sent them on buying trips to more than 40 countries. To his left is Mary Menklin Jenkins. The daughter of a Dartmouth professor, Mary grew up in Hanover. 2 months after graduating from college, she married freshly minted Second Lieutenant John Jenkins and went with him to a B-29 Air Force base in Victoria, Kansas, where he served as an intelligence officer. After the war, while raising 4 children, Mary was the president of a local League of Women Voters in Connecticut, the first women moderator of Westport's representative town meeting, and served on the town's Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as the Board of Finance. She was the recipient of a grant from the West German government to study German women in politics, and also went to the Soviet Union twice on exchanges sponsored by Bridges for Peace, US, and USSR. Finally, we have Dr. Robert Christie, who at the tender age of 16 matriculated at Norwich University, the military college of Vermont, and the oldest private military college in the nation. He enlisted in the United States Army immediately after Pearl Harbor, and after being called up to active duty, he spent a year as an enlisted man before eventually graduating from Officer Candidate School at Fort Knox as a second lieutenant serving in armor. His military service was in Europe as a tank unit commander in Germany from the onset of the Battle of the Bulge until the war's end in 1945. Bob was separated from service in 1946 as a company commander. 40 months later, he returned to Norwich to get his BS, and with the help of the GI Bill, graduated from the State University of New York College of Medicine in New York City. Dr. Christie interned and has held residencies at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, and for 3 years practiced general medicine in Northfield, Vermont. He later specialized in pathology and laboratory medicine, directed 8 hospital labs in New Hampshire and Vermont, and served on the Dartmouth Medical School faculty. His memoir in World War II Remembered reflects his combat experiences and their after effects. So this evening, each of our panelists will speak for roughly 10 minutes, followed by another 10 minutes of facilitated conversation. And then at the very end, we'll open the floor up to general discussions. But before our panelists begin speaking, I'd like to open with a short video from Brian Williams on MSNBC Nightly News from earlier this year when the book, World War II Remembered, that our 3 panelists helped edit at Kendal for Hanover Retirement Community, when that aired earlier this year.
Finally tonight, it might be the greatest slow-motion tragedy of our times, and we can't stop it. The greatest generation is fading from the scene. World War II veterans are dying at the rate of 740 a day, along with everybody else who contributed to the war effort and then worked so hard to build a better country here at home. Some members of that generation are getting their memories down on paper, so we'll all have them. An increasing number of retirement communities are doing it in book form, including a place called Kendal at Hanover in Hanover, New Hampshire. 56 residents have put their stories into a book. They tell the story of World War II at home and away, and some of them they shared with us.
D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Long ago, he was a young man, brave, scared, proud to be a part of a fighting force on a foreign shore trying to save the world. Clint Gardner was an Army first lieutenant on Omaha Beach. He's now 89.
Suddenly, I heard a sharp explosion just in front of me. My head snapped back as if hit by a sledgehammer, and a curtain of warm blood poured over my forehead, closing my eyes.
His helmet still survives from that day. So did he. Though his skull was nearly split apart, his deepest wounds came later in the war when he witnessed the liberation of the concentration camp at Buchenwald.
We were instantly surrounded by this swarm of skeletons draped in yellowing flesh. We saw hundreds of bodies piled outside the crematorium. I realized that I had been changed by this experience.
Home was changing too, as a young newlywed Mary Jenkins found herself on an Air Force base in Kansas.
It was 1944 when I, as a New Englander and a brand new bride, found myself in the heart of Kansas. Our one goal was to win this war, and it was a period that was quite remarkable to live through because it was uplifting, this feeling of unity.
Everyone experienced the war differently, and yet the most unique story in the book may be that of Kessa Noda. As Japanese Americans, her family spent World War II in an internment camp, and she tells her father's story.
I went to a bus depot as ordered. Army soldiers who were there herded us into buses. They took us to the Santa Anita racetrack and told us to get off. There were guard towers and barbed wire around the entire site. We were given one horse stall with horse manure on the walls. It smelled. When I heard the story from my father, I said, "Did you ever give up hope?" And he looked at me as if that was the strangest question. "No, we never gave up hope," he said. "Never."
Robert Christie came home from the war a decorated combat veteran, an experience he translated into powerful verse.
I am not a hunter, I am a killer. I hunted people, women, kids, old people, enemy soldiers, who knows? They never could lay it on me, 2,000 yards away, right? I did it not because I enjoyed doing it, but it was what I did.
Christie became a physician when he came home and never fully got over his scars from over there.
I'm emotional right now, just talking about it.
From one place, 56 stories, 56 different memories of the same war.
Certain kinds of stories you kind of know in your gut aren't just individual stories. There's something more to them that makes them important beyond an individual or even an individual family.
And if these things are not put down on paper very shortly, they're not going to get down on paper. All of us are in our 80s and 90s, and time is getting short.
Our thanks to the authors, the 56 seniors in Hanover, New Hampshire, and all the rest who have left their stories of an era that changed the world. That is our broadcast on a Monday night. Thank you for being here with us as we start off a new week. I'm Brian Williams. We hope to see you right back here tomorrow evening. Good night.
All right, well, after that wonderful introduction, I'd like to invite Clint Gardner to speak.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to read a few sections from my book in preparation for subsequent discussion. I'll try to think of a few issues that I consider questions that I'd like to address in the course of our discussion. Some of the words I read you will have already heard on Brian Williams' excellent film. My memoir is titled Three Unlikely Wounds. I was wounded twice physically, once on D-Day when the mortar fragment, I should say, went through my helmet and made this hole, which the Imperial War Museum told me was the largest in the hole of a living survivor in either World War I or II. They wanted the helmet, so I said, if it's that interesting, I'd like to save it for my grandchildren. So it's now in Ronner Library, and Ronner kindly released it so that it could be here. If you'd like to come down and see my blood, still inside the helmet, it's there. So I'll start with 9 a.m. on D-Day, June 6th. Now it was our turn. Only a half-mile away, the 100-foot cliff above the beach suddenly emerged from mist of low clouds and smoke of gunfire. Machine gun bullets splashed the water around us and clanked on our ship's metal sides. We maneuvered between two still-mined obstacles, then grated to a halt on the sand. Our commander shouted, "The ramp is down," and we jumped off into 2 feet of water, lowered our heads, and waded 40 feet to shore, with the ammo trucks unloading behind us. The beach was strewn with hundreds of bodies. With its camouflage net still neatly in place, that pillbox, which we knew would be to the right of the beach exit road, was spitting fire on us, and the huge concrete barrier that stretched across the exit road was equally untouched. What we'd been told would be the most concentrated air bombardment in history had completely missed its target. When we come to our discussion period, I'd like to get into some questions as to why in the world that could have happened, and what was an invasion planned for many, many months in advance. Now I'll skip on a bit. 5 p.m. As I started to enlarge my foxhole, I heard a thundering blast and realized that the engineers might finally have blown up that concrete barrier which blocked the exit road. Crouching above my foxhole, I looked through the rising dust and saw that they'd succeeded. The barrier was gone. We might soon be off Omaha Dog Green. Suddenly, I heard a sharp explosion just in front of me. My head snapped back as if hit by a sledgehammer, and a curtain of warm blood poured over my forehead, closing my eyes. My whole body shivered into shock. My God, I thought, what's happened? There was a loud ringing sound in my head, and I felt unsteady. Not knowing whether I'd last another minute, I found myself standing up. Then ever so slowly raising my right arm, my right hand found a gaping hole in my helmet. Feeling past sharp metal curls, my fingers continued downward through sticky remnants of hair to touch the soft, wet surface of my brain. I'm not going to continue on, but I will comment that what I felt was a half-inch of flesh that we have above our skull, but I didn't know that there was such a half-inch there. It was only 24 hours later, when I first received medical attention at a Army field hospital set up about a half-mile inland, that I learned that this was not my brain, but that mush. I think I may go rather quickly on the second wound. It was in the city in the town, I should say, large town of Normandy, Belgium. December 30th, Normandy, around 12:45 p.m., as Corporal Cohen, Corporal Stein, Private Reinhardt, and I were getting chow ready, we heard bombs dropping. I looked out the window and saw that it was our own bombers, B-24s. The windows shook and the house rocked. We put on our helmets. I rang the phone to our main command post and reported, "We are being bombed at Red 3. Sergeant Loftus of the infantry had just stepped out of the room and, had stepped into the room, but hearing the bombs, he left again, following Private Reinhardt, who was on his way out to see what was happening. I had just finished saying Red 3, and Loftus and Reinhardt had been out of the room only a second or so, when a terrific explosion flattened the house to the ground. The ceiling and walls fell in on us. The bomb had fallen squarely on the center of the house, about 15 feet from us. Again, I will skip on in the interest of time, but almost more than half of the people that were in the house were killed by the explosion. The Belgian family, the mother and father and their 2 or 3 children were all killed. So it was a devastating experience. And it was, of course, amazing that we had lived. I think it was largely because a large beam had come to rest on the dining room table. We were all near that table. And we were, let's say the beam was here, and we were pushed just below the table, and the table held the worst of the weight of the thing from crushing us completely. The 2 men buried below me were hurt considerably worse than I was. Still, I earned a second Purple Heart. I didn't think you would get a Purple Heart if your own troops wounded you, but you do. Now, what I call the third wound was the experience at Buchenwald Concentration Camp. I volunteered for military government about a month before the war was over. And I described arriving at Buchenwald as follows. April 23rd, 1945. As our Jeep pulled up to the concentration camp's main gate, we were startled by the scene in front of us. Clustering around the gate, like young animals testing their ability to leave their place of birth, were hundreds of human-like apparitions. Scraps of dirty clothing failed to conceal the condition of their bodies. We were instantly surrounded by this swarm of skeletons, draped in yellowing flesh. They shuffled, hobbled, and stumbled toward us, trying to smile, but their lips would not turn up. Their eyes were glassy and bulbous, buried deep behind cheekbones that almost broke through tight-stretched parchment skin. Their voices cackled as they introduced themselves to us in German, Russian, French, and countless other languages. Again, I will skip on in the interest of time, but I soon learned that my knowledge of German made me the point person in our military government team to talk with the prisoners, because they all had learned German, and many of them were German. What I was able to do in the first few days was to concentrate on having the bodies picked up from all over the camp, and instead of having the prisoners do that, we arranged to have 500 people, civilians, come up from the city of Weimar, which was only a few miles away, and those civilians picked up the bodies and helped clean up the camp. And we had them come up daily, a different 500 each day. So the reason I call this 3 unlikely wounds is that I felt I've never suffered any shell shock from D-Day or the being buried at Malmedy. But I do think that Buchenwald left a permanent wound with me. I describe it in the book, but I think you can see why an experience like that might leave you with certain psychological wounds. One of the questions when we come to the question period is whether everybody understands the difference between a camp like Buchenwald and a camp like Auschwitz. Buchenwald was a work camp, and Auschwitz was an extermination camp, a Vernichtungslager, as opposed to a Arbeitslager. And the difference, of course, was tremendous. I think many people would be surprised with what I wrote in the book, that Buchenwald was probably the best of the concentration camps to be in. And again, I will say for the question and answer period, my reasons for putting it that way.
Well, thank you very much, Clint, for sharing those experiences with us. So now we have a couple minutes to take any questions from the audience for Clint, but I'd like to start one off that I had for you. As you're getting ready for the D-Day invasion, which was one of the greatest undertakings in human history, how did you feel? And I was really struck by something that Mary said about this feeling of unity and this massive undertaking. How did you feel? And it sounded like during the invasion there was a sense of things going awry. So could you maybe comment on how it felt during the build-up and maybe how some things went wrong during the fog of war and the landings? And then we'd love to take any comments or questions from the audience as well.
Well, might elaborate on the being. I had not known that we would be that I would be selected along with 3 other officers from our battalion to be advanced scouts. It was quite a surprise. I thought it was fascinating, and needless to say, being locked up for 2 weeks in a barbed wire camp with maybe 1,000 other soldiers, mostly officers. It was an unusual experience. I remember many of us went to church services every other evening or so, and although I was a Protestant, I recall that with several other Protestants we went to Catholic services as well, as we put it, just in case. The preparation was very well done, it seems to me, for the invasion. We knew exactly where we'd be going. For a Dartmouth man, the fact that the thing that we would be looking for as we got off the boat was a big green D on canvas. It would be 5 or 6 feet high, this big green D. But when we landed, the canvas was not there. Everything was in disarray, and it's the difference between the very careful preparation and the complete fiasco on D-Day, when at noon they were even considering making no further landings on our beach and stopping the invasion, at least in that area. That was by far the worst section to be in. If you've seen, let me ask how many of you saw the film Saving Private Ryan? Oh, considerably more than half. Well, that was based exactly on what we saw on our beach. That was based on Omaha Dog Green. It was shot in Ireland, but it very carefully reproduced what the cliff was like, what the killings were, what the deaths were like in the water in the first hour or so of the landing. If I had landed with the engineers, well, way more than half of the engineers were killed in the landing, as was portrayed in that film. Let's see, what was your second question?
Just, when you've pretty much answered it, just...
Maybe I've already come to it. Maybe we should move on to questions which you may have.
What was the reaction of the Germans that you brought into the camp to clean up? Had they been aware of what was going on? And were they reluctant to do the work?
There was no reluctance to do the work, and I can't speak that I can't say that I know in any first-hand way what their opinions or views were, but I picked it up indirectly from a variety of sources, from going down in Weimar, from talking to the acting mayor who was. We found an anti-Nazi, a non-member of the party, person to be mayor of Weimar. In talking to them, I learned that they knew that there was a huge camp there with a lot going on. I think they knew there was brutality, there were 50,000 who died at Buchenwald in ways that were not natural. I mean, there were normal deaths, of course, with 20,000 people. But I don't think that they knew quite how cruel the SS were. It was almost unimaginable to imagine people who would just, if a prisoner was working in the quarry and was not carrying a full load of stone, he might be pushed over the edge of the quarry and just to see him fall to his death. So the SS were extremely brutal people. It's amazing that only 50,000 died at Buchenwald. There were 7,000 Russians that were shot in 2 days. The camp was all, were in national groups. There were Poles, Russians, Germans, Czechs, and so on and so on. There were 1,000 French. If you were in an active work detail and maintained your health, the camp was really a place you could survive, but brutality and killings would occur all around you. But at the camps, at a camp like Auschwitz, there were very few work details. The main work details were herding the prisoners into the gas chambers and picking up the bodies after they were gassed. So over 1 million people were gassed at Auschwitz alone. I don't know if they know the precise figure, but the work camps, the reason I said Buchenwald was probably the best camp to be in is that the SS delegated the operation of the work details and the food distribution and so on to the prisoners' own sub-administration. And the sub-administration was run by German communists who had persuaded the SS that they should take over from a group of criminal prisoners, people who'd gotten in to the camp because of crimes. And for the 5 or 6 years before we arrived, the communists had very effectively run the work details and actually operated the camp. All the SS had to do was to make sure that nobody got in or out of the barbed wire. It was a security issue for them.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We're going to now turn it over to Dr. Christie, if you don't mind.
Certainly. Good afternoon. My experience was quite different from Clint's, but I chose to write some poetry as my part of the World War II Remembered book. My own memoir, Fate's Finger, which had been published a couple of years before, was in detail what my own experience was, and I didn't want to repeat any part of that, and I thought perhaps writing a couple of poems might express my inner feelings. So I might just make a footnote. I also experienced one of the concentration camps. The 3rd Armored Division in which I served was called the Spearhead Division. And we were the first division to come upon the Nordhausen concentration camp, which was another work camp. And I spent only 24 hours there, and then we moved on because our objective was well down the road to another town. But I must say that I had the same initial experience that Clint had in seeing these bodies piled up, and the stench was unbelievable. And I was delighted to get out of there and leave this behind us, no matter what was coming up front. I was walking my border collie around a hayfield at my home up in Coos County, Lancaster, New Hampshire. And one half the way around that field, all of a sudden I had a feeling that I had to write something, and there was something inside me that had to come out. And I couldn't wait to get back to my home and sit down at my computer to write the first poem that I'm going to read to you. I think what I was experiencing and led me to my computer was what now is recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. It wasn't called that. There's an aphorism in medicine that you can't diagnose a disease that hasn't been invented yet. And so it was called, in the First World War, shell shock, and in our war, if you ever saw the film Patton, you get a pretty good idea of how people who had the equivalent of shell shock were treated. So that having been said, I would just like to read these two poems. I'm not a professional poet. I'm a recreational poet, belong to a poetry group up at Kendal, and we share our poetry, but the poem that I'm going to read you is one in the memoir that I put together, and the second one I'm going to read is the epilogue for the book. First poem, Hunter. I'm not a hunter, I'm a killer. Once you have killed, you are a killer, not a hunter. I hunted bullfrogs with a BB gun. I got 'em. I once shot at a dragonfly in flight, a big one, nailed him. When I got a .22, I went for squirrels and chipmunks, got a lot of them. Skun a red squirrel out once, stretched it on a frame of sticks I made myself, and stretched the pelt tight with fishing line. I was proud. I kept it for years. Caught fish, too, sunfish to salmon. That is not called hunting. It has a different name, fishing. Why? Because you catch it by deception and then kill it? I bought a shotgun, good for partridge. At least I ate them. The U.S. Army gave me a Garand, government issue M1. I was a good shot. Expert marksman, the medal said. Then they gave me the 76 millimeter cannon and 3 machine guns attached to Fate's Finger, medium tank, an M4A3. I hunted people with it. Some of them I never saw. Shot them with HEs, high explosive shells, in houses and bleak wrecked towns 2,000 yards away. Women, kids, old people, enemy soldiers, who knows? They could never lay it on me 2,000 yards away, right? I hunted big cats, panzers, tigers, and panthers while they were hunting me. The hunter-killer game. I got all of them first. APs, armor-piercing. Expert marksman, right? Wrong. Lucky bastard. I bought a .30-06, bolt action, an old friend. Still hunted white-tailed deer. But only bucks. One shot, neck or heart. Chivalrous chauvinist. Their antlers hung in my camp. Thank God they couldn't hunt me. I'm not a hunter. I'm a killer. I always will be. I was only a hunter until that first frog. Now I hunt only for truth. I can't kill that. The second poem, as I mentioned, was chosen as the epilogue for World War II Remembered. It was a poem inspired by Andrew Carroll's book, War Letters. It describes the letters home of the GIs in World War II. It's entitled Hawks. Hawks, read the letters, the war letters. How can you read them and not cringe or weep? Choose a war, any war, but then focus on ours, World War II. Do you want to read the carnage at the water's edge? Try a Marine's letter home about the first wave on Iwo Jima, where he lost an eye and part of his face. Do you want to know the view from a B-24 over Palesti? Save a Bubba Young's letter before he died, describing sudden death in the skies and devastation on the ground. Or let Nurse June Wandry describe death in a field hospital. Hawks, have you forgotten, or maybe never knew, of the GI's terror during the shelling at Monte Cassino and the agony at Anzio? Read about Nagasaki. Once again, you can hear the silences of the dead in a dead city, penned in a letter by Fireman First Class Keith Lynch. Enough of their letters have been saved to tell the anguished stories, the notes to Mom, to Susie, a wife about to bear a child, the last letter home scratched out in a blessed interval in a battle's fury. Words penciled and penned by an infantryman, lonely, terrified of death, in a foxhole laden with his own excrement, courageous words of phony optimism to calm the fears of those at home, misspelled words from one who knew he was about to die and didn't, but lived to see his buddy dropped by a sniper's bullet through the head. Read, Hawks, the letters of death and dying. Death, so merciful and sudden and total, or death of a man, his belly ripped open by shrapnel, trying to hold in his spilling guts, plaintively sobbing to anyone asking if he's going to die. And read, Hawks, accounts of the agony of a not yet dead GI lying on the battlefield, calling for his mother. Read the tales of men starving and rotting in a prison camp or a Japanese hell ship, dying of thirst, dehydration, and cholera. Read about the men wantonly bayoneted or beheaded on a death march. How many good and precious lives need to be traded for the death of one madman, of one Hitler, of one Mussolini, of one Hideki Tojo, of one Saddam Hussein? Consider the cynical words of a Joseph Stalin, that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths merely a statistic. Read the letters. Listen to the cautions of the generals who have been there and through it all. They know, but will only get You will only get the answer you ask for, the numbers. You want another war, O kings, presidents, prime ministers, dictators, secretaries of defense, senators, congressmen? Then stand up, O hawks, you super patriots, you who some have called chicken hawks, so sure that you will never have to see battle. Hawks, stand up, enlist. Be the first to enter into harm's way. Offer your own blood, as did kings and princes of old, the likes of Henry V, leading their armies into battle. Take your turn. Have your chance to write a letter from some far-off land, lying to your best friend's mother about how courageously her son or daughter died, suffering no pain. But hawks, first read the war letters. Perhaps then you can think of another way, a way other than the shedding of someone else's blood.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christie, for sharing those poems with us. I know one thing that the first question that came to my mind is why poetry? Has that been a medium that you had experimented with and written with throughout your life, or is that something that only after the war and those experiences that you felt called to work with?
That was almost the first poem I ever wrote, Hunter. I had never thought of writing poetry before. It just came out of me as I was walking around that hayfield. I just couldn't wait to get back in to get it in print. And it just poured out. It was virtually unedited, just came out that way. The time before that I'd written poetry was in the 4th grade. My father had been a World War I pilot, and he was the one who encouraged me to go to Norwich University because he knew a war was coming, and he told me that officers had a better life than enlisted men in the service. But this same father went to my 4th grade teacher and berated her for having his son write poetry. It just wasn't manly. So that was my first poem, and my second one was Hunter.
A friend of mine who's actually in your age group went to your war, and he was probably 18 at most. And the first week that he was there, he was captured by the Germans. And being what we call as stubborn as Rip was, the second day he escaped. And he remembered very vivid details that he could tell me about walking, looking for Americans, and eventually, of course, found some. But the way that he tells it, he can see it in his eyes, and I can see it the way that he explains it, which tells me it was so traumatic for him that he will never forget it. And listening to your poems and listening to you talk, how much of it have you purposely forgotten?
Well, you know, I went back to Norwich to complete my senior year. And Norwich being a military university, was in uniform and lived a military life for my senior year in college. And it wasn't like the military life I had in the service. So I swapped a lot of war stories with my comrades, those that survived. I think almost 15% of my classmates were killed in the war. But after that, I got involved in medical school, and my medical career, and I just never thought about the war after that. It just was completely sublimated, and why it popped up that afternoon 55 years later, I have no idea. But what it told me was that these stories never disappear. They're inside, they may never come out, but I think that's one of the reasons that I decided to write the poems that I did in the book. Yes?
Dr. Christie, I was a small child during World War II in London, right in the path of the bombers, and towards the end of the war, I had a very, very horrific experience involving a flying bomb which fell on the house next door. And then the war finished, and I had a very lovely childhood and all the rest of it. And 65 years later, a warplane of Vermont National Guard, a couple of planes came over, very low, and I found myself reliving that incident. I think a bit like you were visited in the hayfield. And I'm wondering whether you feel as frustrated as I do that we are still at it, we are still damaging children particularly. There are millions of children out there who just are never going to get over these. It's not just when it happens, it lasts a lifetime. And I just feel we don't ever seem to learn our lesson, and I don't know what to do about it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more about that. But, you know, it isn't just war that damages young kids.
Yes, I know. There are all sorts of different traumas, but I'm talking about wartime ones.
Right. And, you know, we don't hear much about the story you just told because people assume pretty much, I guess, that civilians didn't really go through this kind of stress. But when you know about the bombing of London and the devastation of the cities in England during that war from the Luftwaffe, I mean, there's got to be the same kind of trauma within people your age as people our age here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christie. Mary, would you mind finishing us up?
Good afternoon. I have a feeling that I should have preceded Bob. I think he just gave you all the last word on war, absolutely. And I go back now to another time, another thought. I'm not a veteran. I was not a WAVE, a WAC, or a WASP. These interesting acronyms were the names of the women's military organization. The WAVES were the women accepted for volunteer emergency service. That was the Navy, and it's a good thing they had the name WAVES. Can you imagine dealing with that other mouthful? The WACs were the Women's Army Corps. That's pretty obvious. And the WASPs were Women Air Force pilots, service pilots, to be correct. This last group was used to ferry planes from their point of production to the various airfields around the country. Some 25,000 of them volunteered, and when all was said and done, only about 1,000 finished training. We have one of these women at Kendal, and kind of remarkable experiences. One gain from the war came to women. Because of the shortage of men, there were a lot of jobs that opened up for women, and this was one of the small pluses of the day. When Pearl Harbor became a frightening reality, I was a sophomore in college. By a year later, our college lives had become very different. We didn't have boys coming to see us every weekend. I was in an all-female school, and the few boys that showed up were all in uniform. The atmosphere became considerably more serious as we learned of the death of young men we had known and dated. That young sense of immortality and of certainty that our lives would last almost forever disappeared. And as we adjusted to this new life, we clung to the radio and newspaper for the news. We wrote V-mail letters to friends overseas. We knit socks. We became used to gas rationing and the shortage of foods. For example, butter was hard to find, and you had to substitute oleo. So oleo manufacturers came up with a little kernel in the package that you broke and mixed with this horrible white oleo to make you think, or to tease yourself into thinking it was almost like butter. We turned in cans and all kinds of metals that we could find, and pots and pans in the stores were all Pyrex, glass. I had a Pyrex pot explode one night, spewing bits of glass, boiling water, and fragments of cauliflower all over my kitchen. But luckily, I wasn't standing beside the stove. But the most unique aspect of the nation was the nation's mood and an extraordinary feeling of unity. Everyone was united in wanting to fight and win this war. World War II was very unlike the wars that came later. This was a war everyone approved of, not like Vietnam, Korea, and Iraq that sort of split the country. The draft made it everybody's war. All levels of society were equally called to military service. Men wanted to enlist. There are stories of men memorizing an eye chart so they could cheat in their physical and be accepted into the service. And the veterans of World War II came home as heroes. Not like the later veterans, some of whom were ignored when they came back, and others whom, so unfairly, were almost held responsible for having fought in an unpopular war. Politics still went on at election time. Those who hated Roosevelt continued to hate Roosevelt, were very vehement and loud about how he was destroying the country. I saw quite another side of the Roosevelt story in Louisiana, where my husband was then stationed at an air base. When Roosevelt died in the March of '45, the men and women in Alexandria, Louisiana were crying openly on the streets. They were stopping strangers to commiserate about the loss. For some, of course, Roosevelt was the only president they'd ever known, but for others, it was like losing their father. Another unique, amazing thing was going on through those war years, and that was the phenomenal growth of our production of war materiel. Statistics really give testimony to what a nation can accomplish. Luckily, in around 1938, the U.S. started to enlarge and expand their production of ships, planes, and other arms, and this was largely done because they were trying to help Britain. And when Pearl Harbor came then, therefore, because of this, we had already built some new plants and expanded others, but we were nowhere up to the all-out production that was needed. What happened from December of '41 on is stunning. During the course of the war, the U.S. produced 304,000 airplanes of all types. By the end of 1942, we were producing 170 planes a day. The U.S. in '41 produced about 4,000 tanks, and by the end of '42, we had produced 24,000 tanks. And during the course of the war, we produced 28 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 807 cruisers and destroyers, and 203 submarines. Consider this was happening in a period of 4 to 5 years. It was remarkable. The U.S. produced 2/3 of all the military equipment used by the Allies in World War II. We were truly the arsenal of democracy. I want to inject a footnote right now. If any of you are interested in this really phenomenal production and how it evolved as the war continued, there's a wonderful book called Freedom's Forge by a man called Arthur Herman, and it's just quite a remarkable story to read. I got some of my facts from that. I married 2 months after graduation from college and traveled with my husband, who was a brand new second lieutenant in Air Force Intelligence, out to Kansas, where was one of the first groups of B-29s were based. The pilots had all been brought back from the European theater to fly these brand new planes, so there was rank all over the base, captains, majors, and an unusual number of colonels. My poor second lieutenant husband was just saluting all day long. The 29s had been rushed into action because of the need for a long-range bomber in the Asian theater. The older B-17s, which were the plane we had with the longest range, could only fly 2,000 miles without refueling. The B-29s could fly 5,250 miles, but they had tremendous problems. Of the first 129s delivered at the end of 1943, only 15, that's almost as bad, only 15 were airworthy. As one wit said, it's a great plane, except for its engines. And the engines continually caught on fire. A pilot we knew said, "How can we trust this plane when it can't even handle the friendly skies over Kansas?" The pilots longed for the 17s and 24s that they had flown so reliably in their missions over France and Germany. It was chilly to visit the air bases I did one day and see a huge smoldering mass of a 29 at the end of the runway. We spent poignant evenings at the local officers' club listening to the concerns of the pilots and their crews. They were frustrated and worried about the 29s and all their problems. They were sure they'd never make it to Asia, and even more sure they'd never make it back home after the war. A more memorable night, just days before the group left for Asia, we watched a group of the men standing together, arms around each other's shoulders, singing Maisie Dotes and Dozy Dotes. They were very serious and nostalgic, and they were singing to and for each other. One could really feel their tensions and fears. A few days later, our group swooped into the air at dawn in a roar that could be heard for miles around. They joined other groups from nearby bases and set off for Asia by way of the East Coast, apparently to confuse the enemy. Most of our group made it to the Marianas where the B-29s were based, but 3 planes of our group went down with mechanical problems before they even reached the Atlantic Ocean. The B-29, of course, was the plane that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Looking back, it was a time that jarred us into an early maturity. It was also a time that marked our generation. It marked us with a pride for our country and also a very strong sense of patriotism that has stayed with us ever since.
Thank you so much, Mary. One question I had in regards to sort of the zeitgeist of the era on the home front. You spoke a lot about the sense of unity, but I wonder now, looking back, it seems almost inevitable that the United States and the Allies would have won the war. But was there ever, what was the general sense? Was it always very optimistic? Was there a sense of worry? Did it seem like it might go on forever? What was the general thought about
looking
the
back,
war?
it's really, I look back in 2 parts. I look back on some very interesting experiences, friends we made, meeting people from all around the country. But I also look back on a war, and they're all full of sad memories. I had quite a fair number of good friends who died in the war. And I come back really to where Bob is, and I think that's a feeling that came out of that war as well. Yes, this was the right war, we fought it, we won it, but the feeling that war should be entered into so cautiously, and we should be so sure it is the right war, and hopefully there won't be one of those, but a feeling of trying to avoid forever again the things we have messed with, like Vietnam, like Korea, like Iraq, who fell into wars that fell into a different category altogether.
Can you give us a sense of the losses in the air, not only in Europe, but in the Far East? Losses.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Aircraft losses and crew.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
What were the losses in the...
Yeah, of aircraft and of crew in the air.
What were
the
the
people-
losses? Yeah.
I don't actually know. You mean of the group that we were there and knew so well there in Kansas? You speaking of them?
No, just generally speaking through the war.
Well,
I suspect, I think I read somewhere, for instance, in Europe, the B-17 and 24, the losses were something like 24,000 airmen and crew members and planes.
what did he just say? Did you hear him?
He's asking for how many people were killed from the Air Force in
Okay.
Europe and
I don't have that figure.
I
don't.
believe it was a much larger number than that. I just read the figures, and I've forgotten them. But it was a very substantial number. I do know that the total number of deaths of Americans was about 440,000.
Yeah.
And I think that about, if I recollect properly, about 15 or 20% of those were in the Air Corps.
The bigger number would have been in the ground troops, though, I'm sure.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Because you began your remarks talking about the women and the waves and the wax and the wasps, and then focused so much on flying the B-29 and how dangerous the pilots found that plane, I thought I would ask if you've heard of or seen a film called Fly Girls, because it focuses in a very short segment on Commander Paul Tibbets, who had to train the crew that flew over Hiroshima and dropped the atomic bomb, but how he chose and trained some wasps to fly the B-29 and basically persuade the men that it could be flown. Are you familiar with that story at all?
I'm not, but I do have some stories from Louise Brown at Kendal. One thing that struck me in her stories was initially the Army or the Air Force, I guess it would have been, whoever was in charge of the WASPs, were not really accepting them as an arm of the military. When the planes, of course, as you understand, were coming off the lines, the production lines, untested and untried. Even if they were a standard plane, nobody had taken them up before these women got in them to fly them to the bases. And so a number went down with mechanicals. And initially, the U.S. refused to pay the cost of sending the body of that woman home when her plane went down. Well, about the middle of the war, somebody got wise to the fact that this was utterly absurd, and they did. But she said they used to take up collections among themselves to pay the costs.
I think they also pulled banners so that anti-aircraft crews could practice shooting at the banners.
Yes, they did. They did do that. You're
and they
absolutely
sometimes
right.
missed
Yeah,
the banners.
they also had to be cleared on each plane, each type of plane. You know, one person flew only fighters, another only bombers, and very few would fly them all. But they were quite an adventurous, wonderful bunch of women, and they.
Mary, I'm particularly interested in the issues of the home front testing of airplanes and the like. The school I went to lists all the people who were killed in World War II, and I would say a good not healthy is the wrong word, a good percentage of them died in accidents, in training accidents and the like, and they were given the same full recognition there as people who died in D-Day or in Okinawa or others. I just mentioned this, that there was a man in my fraternity in Middlebury who was killed in a training accident in the Vietnam War, and his name isn't down on the list in the list of those who were killed in Washington there, and I think that this is something which I think your generation did better. I don't know if there are other examples of people or institutions who would recognize people who died in training accidents or died stateside as opposed to enemy fire.
Certainly should be included. We went to see the War Memorial too long ago, the new one in Washington. And my husband being in the Air Force, he wanted to see the Air Force Memorial, and we walked around and we found it and we're looking at it. And this man, young man by our standards, probably in his 50s, came up and he said to my husband, "Are you a veteran of the Air Force?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Stand there, I want your picture." Made us feel kind of old.
Brian Williams, at the beginning of this, pointed out what a unique generation you people represent. And you are unique to this day when you are compared even with other military or combat veterans, starting with Korea, if we all know, and going through Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, and Iraq and Afghanistan. There's one big difference between what you people did and what people have done subsequently. And that is that when you enlisted or when you were drafted, you were there for the duration. I spent a year of my life with an infantry battalion in Vietnam. I received letters from my uncle periodically, and my uncle had departed in 1942 for the Pacific and returned in January of 1946 for the first time. I, like everybody who served since your time, knew on the day I arrived exactly to the day how long I would be there. And I could tell you that it was 364 or 111, or if you were under 100, you were short. And that's been true subsequently ever since. So that if, as Brian Williams pointed out, what a unique generation you were, I think this just further exemplifies how truly remarkable you people all were.
So now, why don't we just open it up for general Q&A? We've got about 20 minutes or so ask away.
You said this was a group from Kendal. Were there members of Kendal for whom this was too painful that did not join in, yet who had been part of World War II?
Yes. There were people who chose not to do a memoir because they couldn't handle it.
I was in charge of collecting all the memoirs, and I served as managing editor of the book. So I was well aware of good friends of mine who decided that it was too painful to do it. I knew in at least two cases that they'd seen vastly more combat than the average infantry person does see. Many of you who, certainly I, before I was in the Army, had not realized what a huge percentage of those in the military do not see active combat. Bob may know the figure, but I'd say it's at least it's in the range of half of the people in the military that do not see combat.
Well, it was quite more dramatic than that. There were 16 million people who somehow or other were in uniform during World War II. Only 10% of them actually saw combat.
Wow.
The remainder was support and, as they said, otherwise engaged. So I wondered at the time why I had happened to be selected to be one of that 10%. So the answer is about 1.6 million, I guess.
Of course, it's necessary to have so many in the training. I mean, there's so much goes into the whole thing beyond the actual fighting, the training and all the rest. Yeah.
It's also important to remember that the United States had a relatively small number of people killed who were in uniform. The largest number of them, of course, were Russians. And
20 million.
And it's unknown how many Russian civilians,
They
let
think
alone Germans. And
the Russians think it was about 20 million killed in the war.
so we often forget about that and remembering about the number of American service people who actually lost their lives.
Mr. Gardner, you had mentioned earlier that you were hoping to cover the issue of why that access road hadn't been cleared by air support before you got to the beach. Would you like to explain that now?
Yes, it seems to me that huge concrete barrier, that there should have been a backup plan if the bombers, the B-17s that bombed it about, I don't know, just a few hours before the invasion began. I think they bombed between 2 and 4 in the morning. I'm not sure about that, but something like a couple of hours before the invasion began. If they bombed it much earlier than that, it would have made it easier for the Germans to start moving divisions into that area, but making it just a few hours before the Germans couldn't increase the manpower and the defenses. But they should have anticipated that the bombers might fail. And the fact that they brought the Bangalore torpedoes in at 5 p.m. Seems to me way too late. I don't know the details as to why they couldn't have gotten those Bangalore torpedoes in place at the base of the cliff. That wasn't too hard to reach. I mean, I was only a few hundred feet from the base myself most of the day, and I could have, if I wanted to go in with the infantry, which I did not, I could have helped them put the Bangalore torpedoes into place. So I think that backup plans were not made in sufficient depth. All those bombs were dropped by the B-17s by mistake on orchards about a half a mile or a mile inland from the beach. And they might have had a system where, to be sure that they dropped them on the German defenses, they could have had, it seems to me, flares could have been dropped, flares that would have stayed alight, a flame for 20 or 30 minutes, which would have, they could have been dropped by smaller planes than the B-17s, planes that could go in below the fog and see what they were doing. The fog was a major problem, though. It was very difficult to see what was going on.
I want to remind Clint of my my sweatshirt that I have at Kendal. It says, "Manure occurreth."
I've got a question. One thing that I've always wondered about is this label of the greatest generation. And I wonder what you all think. Do you feel that there truly was something special and unique about your generation that enabled you to overcome this incredible adversity and help win the Second World War? Or do you feel like you were a generation of Americans, much like those past, present, and future, who seized the moment and did what it took? I've always been curious as to what you think is, in terms of, was there something really, was it truly the greatest generation, or was it just a generation that did what it needed to be done?
Well, the idea of the greatest generation never occurred to me until Tom Brokaw wrote his book, The Greatest Generation.
I never thought we were special either. I was amazed by that greatest generation. I don't think we were special. We were thrown into a situation, we responded to it. I think any generation would do the same. And I think if anything great about it, it's the fact that some of us are still around. And that's accident.
I agree with both of my friends here. I thought it was a good promotional term for a book and a good focus for an idea, but it did not strike me that we were uniquely more loyal or devoted to the country or to good causes than other generations.
A question. I don't know if you have any grandkids or children yourselves, but would you want them, or have they enlisted and served in wars themselves?
What was that? I didn't know.
I'm not sure. Could you say it a little more slowly?
Do you have any children or grandchildren who have served in wars themselves, or would you want them to, or not?
I have a grandson who wants to be a Navy SEAL. I've done everything I could to try to persuade him otherwise. I don't know what he will finally decide to do, but I can't think of any harder, tougher duty than being a Navy SEAL. And I would not like to see my grandchildren fight in a war. My brother, who is no longer living but didn't die in the war, couldn't wait to be a paratrooper, simply because it was a great adventure in his mind. And war is a great adventure to a lot of young people. And that, I think, is why it's so easy for the military, and particularly the Marines, which is an all-volunteer organization, to recruit people to become Marines, because there's an element of opportunity to prove yourself, you can't imagine that you yourself are going to die. It's always the next guy that's going to die. You're always going to survive. I think that's sort of inherent in that age group. And that's the reason I try to persuade my grandchildren not to follow this course. On the other hand, I don't mind saying that if the situation was the way it was with World War II, even at my tender age of 89, I would put up my hand to volunteer if there was anything that I thought I could do, because there are some things that you just can't put aside.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I am wondering what parts of your human experience in these stories you are hoping that other generations might be able to be inspired by. Anything that after having gone through these very traumatic experiences in life, like you've come to know camaraderie in a way that perhaps other generations won't know. Anything else that inspires you in that way for future generations?
Clint, do you want to?
No, I should try.
I don't think we went at the book with the thought of inspiring people. I think we went at the book with the thought that we were a generation that's disappearing. We had a set of experiences that no one else has had, and we thought we should get these on paper. And in fact, we had another hope, which was that even our book itself would inspire some other people to do the same kind of thing. Because, pretty soon it's going to be the historians describing what happened then. It won't be people who were there, and there is a difference.
I think that if you put something down as we did, maybe inspiring others is a little too dramatic, but I think of the act of communication, if you hope it will be effective, you are hoping that your readers will learn something other than just the facts, and that when I referred to Buchenwald as a third wound, I was trying to get across the fact that there was something extremely important in realizing what Hitler was up to with the extermination of the Jews and many others. Of course, there were gypsies and homosexuals and others that were all being exterminated. I think one of the stories I haven't touched on adequately in my memoir is to emphasize that at Buchenwald and throughout the camp system, there were huge numbers, millions, that were not Jews who were being exterminated for a variety of reasons. Just being homosexual was one of them.
I think my answer to your question is I said it all in the epilogue.
It takes me back to what I said. I have a difficulty with the word inspire. I'm not trying to downgrade anything that you folks did, but would you not want to put people off? I mean, all the stories you've told are pretty awful and terrifying, and so that was the point I was trying to make, is to get over to people, especially the younger generations, that war is terrible and horrible to many, many people, and let's stop it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, certainly, it does seem to me that there's an inability on certain portions of the U.S. leadership at certain times to think that you can have sort of an optional war. Iraq comes to mind particularly, but there are the case of Vietnam. If you look at the history, it was the notion that China was about to take over all the rest of the East Asia seems to have been largely blown up and not a real likelihood. So that there are huge errors of judgment that are made by political leadership.
Would you describe your own personal experience of being stuck on the beach for an extended period and then breaking through that barrier, and what you did, because you obviously had the German soldiers firing on you even as the concrete barrier was blown up?
You were wounded.
Well, I was largely in a I was conscious, but I was in such bad shape from loss of blood and so on that I don't think that all I could imagine was trying to survive. I do recall wondering whether we would, what would happen in the morning, whether we would be able to continue the invasion, but I think I just remember living one moment to the next, and not being able to figure out much of what to do except to try and keep alive.
What was your rank?
I was a first lieutenant then. I ended my rank, eventually became captain. But I have an amusing story about why I became a first lieutenant ahead of several of the officers in our battalion who we were all started out as second lieutenants, or not all, but there were captains in charge of batteries, but the additional officers in the battery started out as second lieutenants. While teaching anti-aircraft identification, it occurred to me that I would build a projector, a magic lantern. I went into some town on the Cape and bought the materials to make the lantern, a magnifying glass and some wood to build it out of. And I built this thing, and I made it into a very effective tool because we did not have pictures of German planes as they came out. It took the Army some months to get out new manuals, but there were monthly magazines about in the field of aircraft, and they showed the German planes and our planes in very good pictures. So with this magic lantern, I was able to take the magazine pictures and project them, and I increased the speed of identification and the skill of our men in learning learning how to identify different planes. So that little thing, that little project of mine came to the attention of the colonel in charge of our, well, we had a colonel, we had lieutenant colonels in charge of a battalion. There was a colonel in charge of the group of battalions. Colonel Mumford learned about Lieutenant Gardner's little magic lantern, and I became a first lieutenant several months ahead of numerous other guys and the other officers who were a few years older than I. I found that rather heartening.
All right, well, everyone.
One last. I'm Peter Hoteling. And I want to thank Clint, Mary, Dr. Christie.
Yep.
Thank you very much for doing this book. It means an awful lot. My father, there's a chapter in there on my father, which Mary and I went back and forth on. If he was here, I don't know if he'd want to be in the book, but you took it off the CD. He was captured in the Battle of the Bulge, and it does the Hoteling family very proud, the work that you did. And I want to say on behalf of the entire Hoteling family, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm delighted that you were able to be here this evening.
And that's one of my favorite stories is your father's. It's mostly about his time as a prisoner of war. Yeah.
And please, get the book, folks. If you don't have it, get it. It's interesting reading. And the chapter on my father, the opening line, as Mary knows so well, just epitomizes William A. Hoteling, my dad.
That's the perfect segue. We do have a book signing. Books available up in the lobby, and we also have some refreshments. So please help yourselves, and you can further your conversations with the panelists. Thank you all.